Have you ever pondered the question, what do we not know about World War I? World War I, also known as the Great War, is often encapsulated by a few key events and figures. It's the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the trenches of the Western Front, the Red Baron, and the eventual armistice in November of 1918. These are the broad strokes, the common knowledge held by many. But like any significant event in history, the surface-level understanding is just the tip of the iceberg. There's always more to uncover, more to understand, more to question. Our journey today is about shining a light on the darker corners of the Great War, the ones that don't often make it into the textbooks. We're not here to rehash the same stories you've heard time and time again. Instead, we want to delve into those lesser-known facts, the unexpected, the surprising, the shocking. We're here to answer that question, what do we not know about World War I? Perhaps you're a history buff, well-versed in the happenings of the early 20th century. Maybe you're a curious mind, always seeking to learn something new. Or possibly, you're someone who just stumbled upon this video. Regardless, we invite you to join us on this journey. Expect to hear about the triggers of the war, ones that go beyond the assassination of a single archduke. We'll talk about how World War I was a war of innovation, with new technologies and strategies forever changing the face of warfare. We'll delve into the impact on civilians, the often forgotten victims of this global conflict. Lastly, we'll explore how the Great War paved the way for a new world order. So buckle up, we're about to take a trip back in time, back to the early days of the 20th century. Prepare to delve deep into the annals of history as we unravel the unrevealed facts about World War I. We all know that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand sparked the war, but did you know there's more to the story? The assassination, while significant, was not the sole cause, but rather a catalyst that ignited the simmering tensions of the time. The early 20th century was a complex era, a time when the world was a churning cauldron of political intrigue, nationalistic fervor, and imperialistic desires. Let's start with the political climate. Europe, in the early 20th century, was a jigsaw puzzle of shifting alliances. The major players, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, were all engaged in a delicate dance of diplomacy. Agreements were made, alliances formed only to be broken and reformed with different partners. This intricate web of alliances meant that any conflict involving one power could rapidly draw in others, escalating a regional skirmish into a full-blown war. Now let's touch on nationalism. This was a time when the concept of national identity was growing stronger, particularly in areas of Europe that bristled under foreign rule. The Serbian nationalist group, the Black Hand, which was responsible for the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, was just one example of the many nationalist movements of the time. These movements, fueled by a desire for self-determination, often brought them into conflict with the existing imperial powers. And finally, we come to imperialism. The European powers were engaged in a race to expand their empires, particularly in Africa and Asia. This rivalry for resources and strategic advantage created a climate of competition and mistrust. It was this climate that made the powers so ready to go to war when Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. So, you see, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the spark that lit the fuse, but it was the complex political climate, the fervor of nationalism, and the ambitions of imperialism that provided the gunpowder. The assassination was merely the spark that ignited an already volatile situation. Did you know World War I was a war of innovation? It might seem strange to think of a conflict as brutal and devastating as the Great War in such terms, but it's true. The urgency of war has a way of accelerating scientific and technological progress, and World War I was no exception. Let's start with tanks. Before the war, the idea was a mere concept, a dream of a machine that could traverse the treacherous no-man's land between trenches. But by the war's end, tanks were a reality, lumbering metal beasts that forever changed the face of warfare. They offered a solution to the deadlock of trench warfare, able to cross difficult terrain and break through enemy lines. Next came the airplanes. At the outbreak of the war, they were little more than fragile contraptions of wood and canvas, used primarily for reconnaissance. But as the war progressed, so too did aviation technology. By war's end, we had fighter planes and bombers, machines capable of delivering destruction from the sky. The war transformed the airplane from a novelty into a deadly weapon and a crucial piece of military equipment. And then, there were the chemical weapons. This is a darker side of innovation, a testament to the lengths humanity will go in the pursuit of victory. The war saw the first large-scale use of deadly gases like chlorine and mustard gas. It was a horrifying new chapter in the annals of warfare, one that led to the Geneva Protocol banning chemical weapons. World War I was a crucible, a brutal test that spurred humanity to new heights of ingenuity and invention. From the depths of its trenches rose innovations that would shape the 20th century and beyond, from tanks and airplanes to radios and plastic surgery. So, while we remember the war for its carnage and its human cost, we must also acknowledge its role in driving technological progress. World War I, despite its horrors, was a catalyst for technological advancement. Often overlooked, the impact of World War I on civilians was significant. Have you ever wondered how they were affected? The war was not just a series of battles fought on distant fields. It permeated every aspect of life, even for those far removed from the front lines. Imagine the home front, where food became a critical concern. As men left their farms to fight, agricultural production plummeted. Blockades and disrupted trade routes further strained supplies. The result? Widespread food shortages. In fact, by the end of the war, bread in Germany was being made from a mash of turnips. The war, in essence, reached into the kitchens of civilians, changing their daily lives in profound ways. And then there was the Spanish flu, a pandemic that swept across the globe in the final year of the war, exacting a death toll that rivaled the war itself. One might say that the war facilitated its spread, with troops moving across continents, unknowingly carrying the virus with them. Millions of civilians, already weakened by food shortages, fell victim to this unseen enemy. Beyond the physical hardships, the psychological impact of the war was immense. The constant fear of bombings, the loss of loved ones, the uncertainty of the future, all these factors led to widespread emotional distress. A new term was coined, shell shock, to describe the traumatic stress disorders experienced by soldiers, but civilians too experienced their own version of this trauma. The war had invaded their minds, leaving scars that would last long after the guns fell silent. So, you see, World War I was not just a military conflict. It was a global crisis that reached into every corner of society, from the battlefields to the home front, from the physical to the psychological. The ripple effects of the war were felt far beyond the trenches, impacting everyday life. World War I ended and the world was forever changed, but how exactly? In the aftermath of the Great War, the world map was redrawn and the geopolitical landscape transformed. Empires that once stood tall crumbled into the annals of history. The Russian, Ottoman, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires, once mighty and expansive, were dissolved, their territories carved up and redistributed. Europe, the epicenter of the conflict, emerged from the war with borders dramatically reconfigured. Nations were born, others vanished, and some found themselves with new identities, a stark departure from their imperial past. The world didn't just witness the fall of empires but also the rise of new powerhouses. The United States and the Soviet Union, relatively on the sidelines when the war began, emerged as global superpowers in its wake. The United States, having entered the war late, suffered fewer casualties and less devastation compared to European nations. Its economy strengthened and its influence expanded. Meanwhile, in the ashes of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union was born, bringing with it a new political ideology that would shape much of the 20th century. These shifts had profound implications. The balance of power tilted, and the world found itself polarized between the capitalist West and the communist East. This paved the way for ideological conflicts, proxy wars, and a Cold War that held the world in a tense standoff for decades. The aftermath of World War I was a period of great transition. It was a time when the old world order was shattered and a new one was forged in its place. The war didn't just change the nations involved, it altered the global stage, setting the tone for the complex and often turbulent world politics of the 20th century. World War I didn't just reshape the map, it reshaped the world order.